When a black man comes to mount your TV and leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about attraction, boundaries, and what your heart actually wants, well, that's exactly what happened to Sarah Smith the Tuesday afternoon that changed her life forever. This is their story, and it's about to get romantic in ways that will surprise you. Damon Matthews had mounted flat screens in mansions from Buckhead to Sandy Springs, but he'd never encountered a homeowner who made him forget the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. Sarah Smith stood in her pristine living room doorway, honey blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, wearing a fitted black dress that hugged every curve and somehow managed to look both professional and provocative. The kind of effortless elegance that suggested money and confidence in equal measure. "The mount goes there," she said, pointing to the wall above a marble fireplace that probably cost more than Damon's annual salary. Her voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd been on conference calls all morning, corporate authority wrapped in unexpected warmth. Damon nodded, setting his toolkit on hardwood floors that gleamed like mirrors. "Yes, ma'am. Should have you set up within the hour." He'd learned to keep interactions brief and professional in neighborhoods like this, where his work uniform and tool belt marked him as temporary help rather than a person worth knowing. But something about Sarah's presence made the usual boundaries feel less defined, more porous. As he marked drill points on the wall, he felt her watching him work. Not the suspicious surveillance he'd grown accustomed to in wealthy homes, but something else. Curiosity mixed with an attention that made heat crawl up his neck. "You've done this before," she observed, settling onto a cream-colored couch that probably cost more than his truck. The black dress rode up slightly as she crossed her legs, and Damon forced himself to focus on his measurements. "Few times," Damon replied, focusing on his level to avoid looking at how the afternoon light outlined her silhouette. "Professional. Keep it professional." But when he reached for the drill, their hands brushed as she handed him the power strip she'd retrieved from a nearby table. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds, nothing that could be called intentional, but electricity shot through his fingers with enough force to make him pause mid-motion. Sarah's breath caught, barely audible, but Damon heard it. When he looked up, she was studying his face with an intensity that made his pulse quicken despite every instinct screaming warnings about crossing lines that existed for good reasons. "Sorry," she said softly, but didn't move away. The drill hung forgotten in Damon's hand as something shifted in the space between them, dangerous, magnetic, and utterly unexpected. Outside, suburban lawns stretched in perfect uniformity, but inside this living room, the careful distance between service provider and customer had just collapsed into something neither of them had seen coming. The TV mounted perfectly, but Damon found himself taking extra time with the cable management, coiling wires with unnecessary precision. Sarah had disappeared into what he assumed was the kitchen, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume and the memory of that electric moment when their hands had touched. "All finished," he called out, packing his tools with deliberate slowness. "Perfect timing." Sarah's voice drifted from the kitchen. "I was just making coffee. Would you like some?" Damon paused, drill case halfway closed. Coffee meant staying longer, meant crossing another invisible line in the careful choreography of service calls. His training whispered warnings about maintaining professional distance, but something in her tone, hopeful, almost nervous, made him reconsider. "That's kind of you, but I should probably—" "Please." The word stopped him cold. Not the polite insistence of a wealthy client, but something raw, more genuine. "I mean, if you have time." Against his better judgment, Damon found himself walking toward the kitchen. Sarah stood at a massive granite island, blonde hair falling over one shoulder as she worked an expensive coffee machine that probably cost more than his monthly rent. She'd changed, the fitted black dress replaced by jeans and a soft grey sweater that somehow made her seem more approachable, more real. "Cream and sugar?" she asked, not looking up. "Black's fine." She handed him a mug, their fingers brushing again, this time clearly intentional. Sarah's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't pull away. "I don't usually invite the repair guys for coffee," she said, leaning against the counter. "Actually, I don't usually invite anyone for coffee. Work keeps me pretty isolated." Damon studied her face, searching for games or manipulation, but finding only vulnerability. "What kind of work?" "Corporate consulting, efficiency analysis, restructuring recommendations." She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I help companies figure out how to do more with fewer people. Popular at board meetings, not so much at dinner parties." The admission hung between them like a confession. Damon sipped his coffee, tasting something expensive and smooth while processing this glimpse behind her polished exterior. "Must be lonely," he said quietly. Sarah's smile faltered, revealing something fragile underneath the confidence. "Very." The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the space between them charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Sarah looked at him like he was the first person in months to see her as something more than a title and a bank account. "Would you maybe want to stay for dinner?" she asked, the words rushing out before courage could abandon her. "I mean, if you don't have other plans. I could order something." Damon set down his mug, every professional instinct screaming warnings, while something deeper whispered yes. Dinner had stretched into 3 hours of conversation that flowed like aged wine. Stories about childhood dreams, career disappointments, the loneliness that came with success neither had expected. Now, standing beside Damon's work truck in Sarah's circular driveway, the evening air carried autumn's first bite and the weight of unspoken possibilities. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice softer than it had been all day. "I haven't talked like that with anyone in, well, longer than I care to admit." Damon's hand rested on his truck door, keys dangling from fingers that had traced the rim of his wineglass while listening to her laugh. The porch light cast golden shadows across her face, making her look younger, less guarded. "Neither have I," he admitted, the honesty surprising them both. Sarah stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume mixing with the scent of cooling asphalt and distant barbecue smoke. For a moment, the careful distance they'd maintained all evening collapsed entirely. "Mrs. Smith?" A sharp voice cut through the intimacy like a blade. "Everything all right over there?" They sprang apart, as if caught doing something criminal. Across the street, Mrs. Kellerman stood on her manicured lawn in a pink robe and curlers, her Yorkshire Terrier yapping beside her feet. The woman's eyes moved between Sarah and Damon with the calculating precision of someone who collected neighborhood gossip like rare coins. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Kellerman," Sarah called back, her voice taking on the polished corporate tone Damon had heard earlier. "Just having some work done. At 8:30 at night?" Mrs. Kellerman's gaze fixed on Damon's truck, reading the company logo with obvious suspicion. "Seems rather late for installations." The emphasis on the last word carried unmistakable insinuation. Damon felt the familiar weight of judgment settling on his shoulders, the assumption that his presence here at this hour could only mean trouble. "Emergency repair," Sarah said smoothly, moving to stand beside Damon in a gesture that felt protective and possessive. "Storm damage from last week finally caught up with us." Mrs. Kellerman's eyes narrowed, clearly unconvinced. "Well, I suppose these things happen, though I do hope the association won't need to address any disruptions to neighborhood standards." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Damon's jaw tightened, recognizing the coded language he'd encountered in too many. Wealthy neighborhoods! Words that meant exactly what they seemed to mean without saying anything actionable. "Have a good evening, Mrs. Kellerman," Sarah said with finality, as the older woman reluctantly retreated, Sarah turned to Damon with fire in her eyes that hadn't been there moments before. "Don't let her get to you," she said quietly. "Some people see problems where there aren't any," but Damon knew better. In neighborhoods like this, problems had a way of creating themselves. Damon's phone buzzed at 6:30 the next morning, dragging him from dreams filled with blonde hair and wine-softened laughter. Ray's name flashed on the screen. His supervisor. "Never called this early unless something was wrong. Need you in the office before your first call." Ray's voice carried the weight of bad news. "We got a situation." The Tech Connect office sat in a strip mall between a dollar store and a check-cashing place. Fluorescent lights humming over metal desks and motivational posters about customer service excellence. Ray waited in his cramped office, coffee cooling. Beside a stack of complaint forms, "Sit down, D." Ray's expression held the careful neutrality of a man delivering unwelcome news. At 52, Ray had worked his way up from installer to supervisor, his weathered hands and knowing eyes marking him as someone who understood the unspoken rules of their business. "What's this about?" Damon asked, settling into the plastic chair that had seen too many uncomfortable conversations. "Got a call last night, customer complaint." Ray pulled out a yellow form, scanning it with the resignation of someone who dealt with this before. "Mrs. Kellerman, Maple Grove Subdivision. Says one of our techs was at a neighbor's house inappropriately. Late, engaging in unprofessional conduct." Damon's stomach dropped. "She wasn't even a customer. I was working at Sarah Smith's place." "Sarah Smith?" Ray's eyebrows rose. "The blonde in the big house on Magnolia? The one who tips our guys in 20s? Heat crawled up Damon's neck. Word traveled fast in their small company, especially when wealthy clients showed unusual generosity. "Look, D, I've known you for 3 years. You're solid, professional, never given me trouble." Ray leaned forward, his voice dropping to fatherly concern. "But mixing business with pleasure, man, that's dangerous territory, especially in neighborhoods like Maple Grove." "Nothing happened that violated company policy," Damon said carefully. "Policies, one thing, perception's another." Ray tapped the complaint form. "These people pay premium prices because they expect a certain level of discretion. They don't want to worry about service techs getting too comfortable." The words hit like cold water. Getting too comfortable, as if sharing dinner and conversation made him a threat rather than a human being. "What are you saying, Ray?" "I'm saying be careful, real careful." Ray's expression carried genuine concern, mixed with institutional pressure. "Companies got contracts to protect, can't afford to lose clients over misunderstandings." Marcus, Damon's co-worker, knocked on the doorframe. "Morning meeting starting." As they walked toward the break room, Marcus fell into step beside him. "Heard you had some excitement yesterday," he said quietly. "Word of advice? Rich white ladies are nothing but trouble, brother. Trust me on that." Sarah's service request came through the dispatch system 3 days later. Audio issues with the newly installed entertainment system. Damon stared at his tablet, Ray's warnings echoing in his head, while his pulse quickened at the thought of seeing her again. Professional distance, company contracts, rich white ladies are trouble. But when Sarah opened the door, wearing a cream-colored blouse and dark jeans, her smile cautious but genuine, those warnings felt like noise from another. "Planet, thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I wasn't sure if you'd be the one they'd send." "Company policy to follow up on recent installations," Damon replied, keeping his voice neutral while hyper-aware of how her perfume lingered in the entryway. The living room felt different this time, charged with memory and unfinished conversation. Sarah maintained careful distance as he checked connections, but Damon caught her watching him work with the same intensity that had knocked him off balance during their first meeting. "The center channel cuts out during dialogue," she explained, arms crossed defensively. "Thought you should know." Damon knelt behind the entertainment center, fingers working through cable connections while his mind worked through the careful Choreography of professional interaction. Don't get too comfortable. Don't give them ammunition. Found it, he said, tightening a loose connection. Should be good now. That's it? Sarah's voice carried disappointment that had nothing to do with technical repairs. Sometimes the simple fixes are the best ones. Damon stood, packing his tools with deliberate efficiency. Anything else? Sarah moved closer, close enough that he could see the conflict playing across her face. Want wrestling with understanding. Damon, about the other night. That was a mistake, he said quickly, the words cutting them both. Professional boundaries exist for good reasons. Whose reasons? Her voice carried an edge that made him look up. Yours or Mrs. Kellerman's? The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah stepped closer, her hand almost touching his arm, before stopping herself. I know someone complained, she said quietly. I know there was fallout at your work. I'm sorry. Damon's resolve wavered at the genuine regret in her voice. It's not your fault, isn't it? Sarah's eyes held his with uncomfortable honesty. I invited you to stay. I wanted you to stay. And now you're being punished for treating me like a person instead of just another client. The space between them felt electric again, loaded with everything they couldn't say, everything they wanted despite the consequences. I should go, Damon said, but didn't move. You should, Sarah agreed, stepping closer anyway. But I don't want you to. The admission settled between them like a confession neither could take back. The Maple Grove Community Center smelled like burnt coffee and air freshener, its beige walls decorated with cheerful reminders about upcoming block parties and recycling schedules. Sarah sat in the back row of folding chairs, watching neighbors file in with the resigned politeness of people fulfilling civic duty. She'd lived here 2 years and attended exactly 0 association meetings until tonight's agenda item caught her attention. Service provider standards and community safety. Mrs. Kellerman presided from the front table like a pink-suited general, her Yorkshire Terrier quiet for once in a rhinestone-studded carrier. Bob Harrison, the association president, shuffled through papers with the enthusiasm of a man who'd rather be watching football. Next item, Bob announced, adjusting his reading glasses. Dolores has concerns about service provider protocols. Mrs. Kellerman stood, smoothing her skirt with theatrical precision. Thank you, Bob. As many of you know, I've observed some troubling patterns regarding outside contractors and their interactions with residents. Sarah's stomach tightened. Around her, neighbors leaned forward with the anticipation of people about to hear interesting gossip, disguised as community concern. Could you be more specific? Asked Janet Moore from the third row, her voice carrying genuine confusion. Well, Mrs. Kellerman's voice dropped to conspiratorial levels. I've noticed certain service personnel lingering unnecessarily long at properties, engaging in what appears to be social rather than professional interaction. It raises questions about boundaries and, frankly, security. Tom Brennan nodded sagely. We pay premium prices for professional service. That includes maintaining appropriate distance. Exactly, Mrs. Kellerman continued, her eyes finding Sarah's across the room. Last week I observed a repair technician at a neighbor's home well past normal business hours. The situation appeared irregular. Sarah felt heat rise in her chest, recognizing the careful language designed to imply without accusing. Around her faces turned thoughtful, concerned, buying into the narrative being carefully constructed. Are we suggesting background checks for contractors? Janet asked. I'm suggesting, Mrs. Kellerman said with practiced precision, that we establish clear guidelines about appropriate service provider conduct, time limits for visits, protocols for after-hours calls, standards that protect both residents and maintain neighborhood integrity. The word integrity hung in the air like a dog whistle, carrying meanings that everyone understood, but no one would speak aloud. Sarah stood before she realized she was moving, her corporate training kicking in, like muscle memory. What specific policies are you proposing? Mrs. Kellerman's smile was sharp as winter air. I'm so glad you asked, dear. I think we should discuss this in detail. The room fell silent, and Sarah realized she'd just walked into a trap designed specifically for her. The glass towers of downtown Atlanta gleamed in morning sunlight, but Sarah felt none of their usual energy as she stepped off the elevator onto the 42nd floor. Strategic Solutions Inc. hummed with the quiet efficiency of a company that charged Fortune 500 clients 6 figures for her analysis, and today that efficiency felt like a trap. Sarah. Her assistant Marcus looked up from his desk with unusual tension. Richard wants to see you. Conference room 3. Richard Blackwood sat at the polished mahogany table like a judge preparing to deliver verdict, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Beside him, Patricia Chen from HR arranged files with the careful precision of someone documenting a difficult conversation. "Close the door," Richard said without looking up. Sarah settled into the leather chair across from them, her corporate armor, navy blazer, pressed slacks, confidence earned through a decade of climbing ladders, feeling suddenly inadequate. "We need to discuss your client relationship management," Richard began, his voice carrying the neutral tone of corporate speak designed to sound reasonable while delivering threats. "Specifically, some concerns that have come to our attention about your community involvement." Sarah's stomach dropped. "I'm not sure what you mean." Patricia slid a printed email across the table. "Mrs. Dolores Kellerman, Maple Grove Neighborhood Association. She reached out yesterday with questions about our employee conduct standards." The email's subject line read, "Professional concerns regarding employee behavior." Sarah scanned the carefully worded paragraphs describing inappropriate fraternization and questionable judgment affecting community standards and property values. "This woman has no connection to our company," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "She has connections to people who do," Richard replied. "Tom Brennan sits on First National's board. Janet Moore's husband runs procurement for Gold Star Industries. These are not people whose concerns we can dismiss." The implications hit like cold water. Her neighbors weren't just gossiping, they were networking, using professional channels to apply pressure where it would hurt most. "My personal life has never interfered with my work performance," Sarah said carefully. "Performance isn't the issue," Patricia interjected, her tone clinical. "Perception is. Client confidence depends on maintaining certain standards of professional judgment." Richard leaned forward, his expression almost paternal. "Sarah, you're one of our best analysts, but this situation reflects poorly on your decision-making abilities. Clients need to trust that you understand appropriate boundaries." The word boundaries hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah realized she was being asked to choose between her career and her right to live her life on her own terms. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said quietly. Richard's smile was sharp as a blade. "We think a change of scenery might be beneficial. Perhaps our Birmingham office." Damon sat in his truck outside the Quickmart on Ponce, engine idling while his world crumbled in real time. Sarah's text had arrived 20 minutes ago, 3 simple words that carried the weight of systematic destruction. They found out. So, afternoon traffic blurred past his windshield like a river of metal and glass, but all he could see was the careful architecture of their separate lives collapsing. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. "We need to talk. My place." "Please, please," that single word cut through him like a blade. Sarah Smith, who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals, was asking, begging for his time while her world burned because of choices they'd made together. Damon's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. 3 weeks ago, His biggest concern had been making rent and keeping his supervisor happy. Now, he was caught in a web that stretched from neighborhood association meetings to corporate HR departments, all because he'd had the audacity to share dinner with a woman who saw him as more than hired help. The rational choice was obvious. End it now before more damage spread. Sarah would recover. People like her always did. Money and connections providing cushions that people like him could never afford. She'd find another job, maybe in another city, and eventually this would become an interesting story she told at cocktail parties about the time she almost dated the TV repair guy. But Damon would carry the weight forever. Not just of losing her, but of running when someone finally saw him as worth fighting for, of proving every whispered warning right, that mixing with clients was dangerous, that reaching above his station only led to destruction, that people like him belonged in the shadows where they couldn't complicate anyone's carefully ordered world. His phone rang. Sarah's name flashed on the screen, and Damon stared at it through 3 rings before answering. "Damon?" Her voice carried exhaustion and something that might have been desperation. "Are you coming?" The question held layers of meaning that had nothing to do with geography. Are you coming to talk? Are you staying in this fight? Are you choosing us over safety? Damon closed his eyes, thinking of Marcus's warning about rich white ladies being trouble, thinking of Ray's careful concern about company contracts, thinking of his mother's medical bills and the careful stability he'd built through years of keeping his head down and his mouth shut. Then he thought of Sarah's laugh over wine, of the way she'd looked at him like he mattered, of the fire in her eyes when Mrs. Kellerman had threatened them both. "I'm coming," he said, and pulled into traffic. Sarah's laptop glowed in the dim light of her living room, the cursor blinking in the comment box like a heartbeat. The Maple Grove neighborhood Facebook group had exploded overnight. 43 comments on Mrs. Kellerman's post about maintaining community standards and concerning patterns of behavior among service providers. Most of the comments danced around direct accusations with the careful precision of people who understood legal liability, but the meaning was crystal clear. Sarah scrolled through observations about inappropriate fraternization and concerns about property values and neighborhood safety, each euphemism feeling like a slap. Then she saw Tom Brennan's comment. "Some people forget that service personnel are paid to work, not socialize. Boundaries exist for good reasons." 12 likes, including one from her next-door neighbor Janet, who'd borrowed Sarah's hedge trimmer just last month. Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard, corporate training warring with something fiercer, more primal. Her entire career had been built on calculated responses, carefully worded statements designed to avoid offense while achieving objectives. But this wasn't a boardroom negotiation. This was her life, her choices, her right to connect with another human being without a committee's approval. Damon would arrive soon, probably armed with reasonable arguments about protecting both their futures. He'd suggest backing away, maintaining distance, letting the storm pass, and maybe that was the smart play. But Sarah was tired of smart plays that required her to pretend parts of herself didn't exist. She began typing, her fingers moving with the same precision she used for corporate analysis, but aimed at a very different target. I've read these comments with interest, particularly the concern about appropriate boundaries between residents and service providers. Let me be clear. Damon Matthews is a skilled professional who has provided excellent service to this community. He's also an intelligent, thoughtful man who treats people with respect regardless of their bank account balance. If my neighbors are uncomfortable seeing service workers treated as human beings rather than invisible help, that says far more about your character than theirs. The only boundary being crossed here is the one that says some people matter less than others based on their profession. I'm proud to know Damon. I'm proud of the time we've spent together. And I'm disappointed in neighbors who think gossip and coded language make acceptable substitutes for honest conversation about what's really bothering them. She paused, finger hovering over post, knowing this would change everything. Her phone buzzed. Damon, probably 5 minutes away. Sarah hit post and closed the laptop. When he arrived, she wanted to show him what it looked like when someone refused to be ashamed of seeing him as worth defending. The Maple Grove Community Center had never seen a crowd like this. What started as an emergency neighborhood association meeting had exploded into something larger when Sarah's Facebook post went viral, shared beyond their small community into networks of service workers, social justice advocates, and local news outlets. Folding chairs stretched to the back walls, and people stood along the perimeter with the energy of witnesses to something significant. Damon sat in the third row beside Sarah, his work uniform replaced by a pressed shirt and tie, his presence no longer something to hide or apologize for. Around them, faces he recognized from service calls mixed with strangers holding smartphones and notebooks. Reporters, activists, neighbors from other subdivisions who'd seen similar dynamics in their own communities. Mrs. Kellerman sat at the front table looking like a general whose battle plan had backfired spectacularly. Bob Harrison shuffled papers with the desperate energy of a man trying to regain control of a meeting that had slipped beyond his authority. "I think we need to address the elephant in the room," Sarah said, standing without waiting for permission to speak. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who'd stopped caring about playing nice. This was never about service standards or professional boundaries. This was about discomfort with seeing working-class people, particularly people of color, treated as equals in spaces you consider exclusively yours. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some supportive, others uncomfortable. Damon felt the weight of dozens of eyes, but for the first time, he didn't feel the urge to shrink or disappear. "That's completely unfair," Mrs. Kellerman protested. "We simply want to maintain—" "What exactly do you want to maintain?" The question came from Maria Santos, a housekeeper whose face Damon recognized from various neighborhood homes. She stood near the back, still wearing her work uniform. "Because I've been cleaning houses in this community for 8 years, and I've heard every code word, every polite suggestion that I should remember my place." More service workers began standing. Landscapers, contractors, delivery drivers who'd apparently organized after seeing Sarah's post. Damon realized this had grown beyond their personal situation into something that had been building for years in communities across the city. "I've been written up for being too familiar with clients," said Jerome Washington, a security guard Damon recognized from several office buildings. "Same week I helped Mrs. Patterson carry groceries when she fell. Apparently kindness looks suspicious when it comes from someone like me." The room fell silent, the weight of accumulated experiences settling like dust after an explosion. Sarah looked at Damon, her eyes asking a question he'd been avoiding for weeks. He stood, finally ready to speak his truth, in public. The local news van parked outside Sarah's house felt surreal, but not as surreal as the text message from her CEO that morning. "Saw the coverage. Proud of you. Let's talk about expanding our diversity consulting practice." Damon's phone hadn't stopped buzzing either. Ray had called twice, torn between panic about company liability and genuine pride in his employees' courage. "Half the board wants your head," Ray had admitted. "The other half wants to hire you as a consultant on workplace dignity. Hell of a thing, D." Sarah found Damon on her back patio, staring at his phone with the expression of someone watching his world reshape in real time. She set coffee beside him and settled into the adjacent chair, close enough to touch, but giving him space to process. "Channel 11 wants an interview," she said quietly. "Something about service industry discrimination and community accountability. Damon looked up, his eyes holding exhaustion mixed with something that might have been hope. Marcus called. 3 other tech companies reached out after seeing the forum coverage. Apparently standing up for yourself is good marketing now. They sat in comfortable silence, watching autumn leaves drift across perfectly manicured lawns while neighbors walked past in careful clusters. Some offered subtle nods of support, others maintained pointed distance. The community was fracturing along lines that had always existed but never been spoken aloud. "Janet stopped by this morning," Sarah said. Apologized for liking Tom's comment. Said she'd been thinking about how she treats her housekeeper differently than her book club friends, and it made her uncomfortable. "People are talking," Damon agreed, "but not all of it's bad. Maria Santos told me the landscaping crew is organizing, want to push for dignity clauses in their contracts." Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood Facebook group. The post count had climbed to over 200 comments, but the tone had shifted. Service workers were sharing stories. Residents were examining their own behavior, and younger neighbors were challenging assumptions their parents had never questioned. "Mrs. Patterson called," Sarah added, almost smiling. "Wants to know if you'd be willing to teach her grandson about electrical work, paid apprenticeship. Apparently watching you speak made her realize she'd never actually talked to any of the people who maintain her world." Damon's laugh held genuine surprise. "The woman who complained about me being too familiar?" "Same one. People change when you force them to see what they've been ignoring." A car pulled into the driveway, sleek, expensive, unfamiliar. Through the window, they could see a woman in a business suit checking her phone with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems quickly. "Expecting company?" Damon asked. Sarah shook her head, standing as the woman approached with purpose and confidence that suggested this conversation would matter. The Maple Grove Community Center buzzed with energy that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago. The Service Industry Appreciation Day banner stretched across the entrance, but the real transformation was visible in the faces mixing throughout the room. Contractors chatting with homeowners over barbecue, children playing together while their parents from vastly different economic backgrounds discovered common ground. Damon adjusted his tie, still getting used to the weight of his new business cards. Matthews Technical Consulting, bridging communities through professional excellence. Had a nice ring to it, even if the corporate speak made him smile. His client list had exploded after the forum coverage, but more importantly, he'd become a catalyst for conversations that needed to happen. "You clean up nice," Sarah said, appearing beside him with 2 glasses of lemonade. She wore a sundress that hugged her curves in ways that still made his breath catch, showing off the tan she'd earned volunteering with Maria Santos's new landscaping cooperative. Corporate consulting still paid the bills, but community organizing had become her passion. "Still feels weird being the guest of honor instead of the help," Damon admitted, watching Mrs. Patterson deep in conversation with Jerome Washington about starting a neighborhood watch program that actually included the people who worked in the neighborhood. "You were never just the help," Sarah said, her fingers finding his with the easy intimacy of 6 months together. "You were always someone worth knowing. It just took everyone else a while to figure that out." The woman in the business suit from that day turned out to be Carmen Rodriguez, a labor rights attorney who'd seen the news coverage and wanted to discuss systemic change. Her foundation now funded dignity training for homeowner associations across 3 states, using Maple Grove as the model for what was possible when communities chose growth over comfort. "Damon!" Mrs. Kellerman's voice carried across the room. She approached with the careful smile of someone still adjusting to new realities. "I wanted you to meet my nephew Bradley. He's starting his own handyman business and could use some mentoring." The young man beside her extended his hand with nervous energy. I saw your interview on Channel 11. Really inspiring stuff about treating service work like a profession instead of just manual labor. 6 months ago, Mrs. Kellerman had tried to have him banned from the neighborhood. Now she was asking him to mentor family members. Change was messy, imperfect, sometimes grudging, but it was real. As evening light filtered through the community center windows, Damon watched children playing together, regardless of whether their parents owned houses or cleaned them, and realized something beautiful. Love hadn't just conquered prejudice, it had built bridges that made the conquest permanent. Sarah's hand slipped lower, her thumb tracing circles on his palm that made heat pool in his stomach. Ready to go. "Home?" she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. Home, to the house they now shared, where she'd learned exactly how skilled his hands were at more than just electrical work. Where the same fingers that mounted TVs and fixed broken circuits could make her forget every rule she'd ever followed about appropriate boundaries. "Give me 5 minutes to say goodbye," he murmured back, his voice rough with promise. Sarah's smile was pure mischief. "I'll be in the car. Don't keep me waiting too long. I have plans for those hands tonight." As she walked away, hips swaying with deliberate invitation, Damon realized they'd built more than just community change. They'd created a foundation strong enough to support both their professional dreams and their most intimate desires in a neighborhood that had learned to celebrate both.